In November 1875, the British government had a problem it could not solve. The Suez Canal had just opened, a man-made river cutting through the desert of Egypt, joining the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. For an empire that ruled India, it was the most important shortcut on earth. And it was about to slip into the hands of France. Britain needed £4 million to buy a controlling stake, immediately, in secret. More money than the government could raise through Parliament in time. So the Prime Minister did not turn to a bank of the state. He turned to a family. By the next morning, the money was arranged. Britain seized its stake in the canal, and the man who made it possible asked only one thing in return: a commission, and the quiet understanding that when empires needed money, there was one name they could always call: Rothschild. For more than 200 years, that single name has surfaced wherever war, debt, and power meet. They have been called bankers to kings, financiers of empires, the hidden hand behind revolutions. Some stories say they funded both sides of every war. Some say they knew the outcome of Waterloo before the British government did. Some say they have controlled the money of nations for centuries. Most of those stories are not true. But here is what makes the Rothschilds one of the most fascinating subjects in all of history. The truth is strange enough on its own, because behind the myths is a real family, 5 brothers born in a sealed-off alley in Frankfurt, who built something the world had never seen before. Not an army, not a kingdom, a network. By the 19th century, the kings and governments of Europe had discovered a brutal truth. Armies could win battles, but credit won wars. A nation could have soldiers, ships, and cannon, but without gold to pay them, without loans to fund them, without a way to move money across hostile borders faster than the enemy, the whole machine ground to a halt. The Rothschilds entered history not as generals and not as kings. They entered as something the most powerful empires on earth needed just as desperately. They became the financial infrastructure of power itself. This is the story of how they did it, and of how their name became a legend that outgrew the truth. We are going to follow the wheel of fortune from the narrow streets of a Frankfurt ghetto to the bond markets of London, from a coin dealer's table to the financing of nations, from documented history to dangerous myth. And we are going to be careful every step to tell you which is which. Because by the end, the real question will not be whether the Rothschilds secretly controlled history. The real question will be far more unsettling. How much of history has always belonged to whoever could pay for it? This is Fortuna's wheel, and the wheel begins in Frankfurt. Myth and record. Before we go any further, we have to make an honest agreement about how this story will be told. Because few names in history have been buried under more rumor, admiration, suspicion, and outright propaganda than this one. For 2 centuries, the Rothschild name has been a magnet for conspiracy. They have been accused of controlling the world's wealth, of owning every central bank, of starting wars for profit, even of engineering disasters. Almost none of it survives contact with the historical record. So throughout this documentary, we are going to separate 3 different things. There is what is documented, supported by letters, ledgers, and the family's own archives. There is what is exaggerated, real events stretched into legend. And there is what is invented, claims that were manufactured. sometimes by people who simply hated them. We will not treat rumor as fact, but we also will not pretend the real story is small. Because the documented Rothschilds were extraordinary enough. The myth is loud, but the machinery underneath it is far more interesting. And to understand that machinery, we have to go back to a place most of their legend conveniently forgets. A place where the family did not begin with power or gold or influence. They began with a much smaller problem: survival. The Green Shield. Frankfurt, in the middle of the 18th century, in the heart of this prosperous German city, ran a long, narrow, walled street called the Judengasse, the Jews' Lane. Since 1462, the Jewish residents of Frankfurt had been confined here by law. The gates were locked at night and on Sundays, and on Christian holidays. Inside, more than 3,000 people were crowded into a strip of houses barely a few meters wide. Jews were forbidden from farming, from most trades, from many of the streets of the city beyond the wall. They could not even walk in the public parks. It was here, in 1744, in a house marked by the sign of a red shield, that a boy named Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born. The family name came from that house. Zum roten Schild, the sign of the red shield, hung over the door generations earlier when houses were marked not by numbers, but by symbols. A red shield still sits at the center of the Rothschild crest today. Mayer's childhood was not gentle. When he was around 11, smallpox swept through the Judengasse and killed both of his parents within a year of each other. The orphan boy had been studying to become a rabbi. Instead, at 13, he was sent away to apprentice at a banking house in the city of Hanover. And there, in those few years away, Mayer Amschel learned the thing that would change everything for his family. He learned how money moved, how loans worked, how a bill of exchange could turn a promise into spendable value across a great distance. He was learning the mechanics of a system that the world was only beginning to build. When he returned to Frankfurt, he started small. He became a dealer in rare coins. It seems almost too modest a beginning for a dynasty. But coins were the perfect entry point. They brought him into contact with collectors. And the greatest collectors were noblemen with deep pockets and a hunger for rare and beautiful things. Mayer was clever, charming, and relentless. He understood that the coin itself was not the real prize. The relationship was, and one relationship would matter more than all the others: the prince and the factor. His name was Wilhelm, Crown Prince of Hesse-Kassel, and one of the wealthiest rulers in all of the German lands. Wilhelm's fortune was vast, and it came from a grim and very specific business. Hesse-Kassel rented out its young men as soldiers. Tens of thousands of Hessian troops were hired out to foreign powers, most famously to the British Crown, which used them to fight in places as far away as the American Revolution. The blood of Hessian soldiers was converted, quite literally, into one of the largest private fortunes in Europe. And a fortune that size needed managing. Mayer Amschel had first connected with the Hesse court the way he connected with everyone, through rare coins. He sold them to Wilhelm at generous prices, sometimes at a loss, building trust one transaction at a time. In 1769, he was granted the title he had been working toward: court factor, official financial agent to the prince. It was a foot in the door of real money, and Mayer pushed it open with patience that bordered on genius. Slowly, he moved from selling coins to handling currency exchange, from currency to discounting bills, from bills to managing portions of the prince's immense wealth. This is the part of the story worth pausing on. Mayer Amschel Rothschild did not become powerful by being the richest man in the room. For most of his life, he wasn't. He became powerful by becoming useful to the people who were, by making himself the trusted hands through which a prince's fortune flowed. In an age when a Jew in Frankfurt could not own property outside a locked street, Mayer Amschel built something the walls could not contain: a reputation, trust that could travel. And trust, it turns out, was the one asset that could be inherited. Because Mayer had one more idea, and it was the idea that would change everything.
5 sons, 5 cities. Mayer Amschel Rothschild had 10 children. 5 of them were sons. And he looked at those 5 sons and saw something no court factor before him had ever quite managed to build. Most court factors rose and fell within a single lifetime. They served a prince, accumulated wealth, and then, through expulsion, theft, or simple bad luck, their fortunes vanished when they died. The wealth never survived the man. Mayer intended to break that pattern. He would not place his fortune in land, which could be seized. He would not place it in one city, which could turn against him. He would place it in his sons, and he would scatter them across Europe like seeds. The eldest, Amschel, would stay in Frankfurt and hold the original house. Salomon would go to Vienna, into the heart of the Austrian Empire. Nathan, the most aggressive, the most brilliant, the most difficult of the brothers, had already gone to England. Karl would go south to Naples, and the youngest James would go to Paris, the capital of the very nation Britain was fighting. 5 brothers, 5 of the most important financial capitals in Europe. One family. In 1810, Mayer formalized it. A partnership agreement bound the brothers together into a single enterprise, M.A. Rothschild and Sons. They would conduct their business jointly, they would pool their profits, and they would follow 2 rules Mayer laid down above all others. Always act together and never reach for excessive profit on any single deal. 2 years later, in 1812, Mayer Amschel Rothschild died in the same Frankfurt ghetto where he had been born. He was buried in the old Jewish cemetery beside the wall of the Judengasse. His grave is still there today. He did not live to see what his sons would do with the machine he had built, but the design was already complete, and it was about to meet the perfect storm to test it, because all across Europe, the cannons were already firing. The gold that moved armies. Consider subscribing to Fortuna's wheel. The wheel is just beginning to turn. The Napoleonic Wars remade the map of Europe. They also remade the business of money. For more than 2 decades, the continent was at war, and war on that scale demanded something armies had always struggled with: cash. Real, spendable, physical money in the right place, in the right currency, at the right moment. A British army fighting in Spain could not be paid in promises. It needed gold on the ground, in soldiers' hands. And getting it there, across a continent controlled by the enemy, was one of the hardest problems of the age. This was the problem Nathan Rothschild solved. From his base in London, Nathan had built the British branch into a force of its own. And between 1813 and 1815, he took on one of the most complex financial operations of the entire war. The British government needed to fund the Duke of Wellington's armies on the continent, and to pay subsidies to its allies fighting Napoleon. Nathan organized it, sourcing enormous quantities of gold, moving it across borders, converting it into the right currencies, and delivering it where it was needed. This is the real foundation of the Rothschild fortune. Not a trick, not a conspiracy. A logistical machine of staggering difficulty run by 5 brothers who could move money and information across Europe faster than the governments themselves. Think about what their network actually gave them. A letter from Nathan in London could reach James in Paris through private couriers who crossed borders that armies could not. Information about prices, about politics, about the movement of gold flowed through the family faster than through any government channel. In a world without telegraphs, without telephones, the Rothschilds had built a private nervous system stretched across a continent. And that meant that when a government was desperate, when it needed money faster than its own bureaucracy could move, there was one family that could say yes when no one else could. The Rothschilds did not command armies. They solved the problem every army creates. How do you pay for it? And then came the single day that would turn that real power into something else entirely. Something the family could never fully control again. A legend. Waterloo and the birth of a legend. June the 18th, 1815. A muddy field in Belgium. The Battle of Waterloo. By the end of that day, Napoleon was finished, and the shape of the next century of European history was set. And according to legend, one man in London knew it first. The story goes like this. Nathan Rothschild, through his private couriers, learned of Wellington's victory a full day before the British government. He rushed to the London Stock Exchange. But instead of buying, he began to sell, dumping British government bonds called consols in full view of the other traders. The watching crowd panicked. Rothschild is selling. Rothschild knows. Wellington must have lost. Prices collapsed. And at the very bottom, Nathan's secret agents quietly bought up the entire market for pennies. When the real news of victory arrived, the bonds soared, and Nathan had made one of the greatest fortunes in history in a single afternoon, built in deception. It is a brilliant story. It has been retold for 200 years in encyclopedias, in novels, in films. And it is, in almost every important way, false. Here is what the historical record actually shows. Nathan's couriers probably did bring him news of Waterloo ahead of the government. The family's information network was genuinely that good. That part may be true, but the dramatic tale of crashing the market through deception did not come from any contemporary account. It first appeared decades later, in 1846, in a hostile French pamphlet written specifically to attack the family. It was then embellished by later writers and eventually, most chillingly, turned into a Nazi propaganda film in 1940. The historian Niall Ferguson, who was given unprecedented access to the family's private archives, examined the numbers. And he found that the market in British bonds in those few days was simply too small for the legendary killing to have happened. Even with advanced knowledge, the profit would have been modest. Nothing like the millions of legend. But Ferguson found something far more interesting. The Rothschilds had actually been betting on a long, drawn-out war. Napoleon's sudden, total defeat at Waterloo did not help them. In the short term, it disrupted their positions and may have cost them. The men the legend paints as triumphant war profiteers were, in that moment, scrambling to recover. So why does the legend survive? Why, after 2 centuries, do we still tell the dramatic version? Because it reveals something true about finance, even when the facts are wrong. In a world of incomplete information, knowing something before everyone else really is a kind of power. The legend exaggerates how Nathan used that power, but it correctly identifies what made the Rothschilds dangerous to their competitors. Not gold, information. The myth was a distortion, but it grew from a real seed, and it was about to grow into something the family could never uproot. Bonds, rails, and the real empire. After everything you just heard, do you believe the myth became more powerful than the truth? Tell me in the comments. While the world fixed its imagination on Waterloo, the real Rothschild empire was being built somewhere far less dramatic. Not on a battlefield, in the bond market. To understand the family's true power in the 19th century, you have to understand what a government bond actually is. When a state needs money to fight a war, to build a railway, to cover its debts, it can borrow by issuing bonds, pieces of paper that promise to pay the holder back with interest over time. The buyer of the bond is, in effect, lending money to the government. The Rothschilds became the masters of this market. They didn't just lend to governments, they organized the loans, placed the bonds with investors across their network of cities, and made markets in the debt of nations. Austria, France, Britain, Prussia, Naples, Brazil, and beyond. When a government wanted to borrow, the Rothschilds could raise the money across 5 countries at once, faster and more reliably than anyone alive. And as the century went on, their money flowed out of war and into something new, the Industrial Revolution. They financed railways across Europe, the iron arteries of the modern economy. They invested in mines, in metals, in the infrastructure of the new industrial world. And in 1875, as we saw at the very beginning, they financed Britain's secret purchase of the Suez Canal, handing the empire control of its lifeline to India. This was the real empire, not a conspiracy to control the world, but something subtler and, in its way, more powerful. The Rothschilds had made themselves indispensable to many governments at once. They were the family every state in Europe might need, and that very usefulness was their fortune and their protection. By mid-century, they held the largest private fortune in the world. By some measures, the largest in modern history, even adjusted for inflation. A record some historians believe has never been broken. They built or owned at least 41 palaces. A British Chancellor of the Exchequer would call Lord Rothschild the most powerful man in Britain. But here is the irony the conspiracy theories never mention. By the time the Rothschilds had become the great managers of government debt, they had also become deeply invested in peace, because war is poison to a bond portfolio. When conflict threatens, the value of existing bonds falls, and the Rothschilds were holding enormous quantities of them. As Neil Ferguson put it, having made their money, they now stood to lose more from war than they gained. The family the myth paints as a secret engine of every war had, in reality, become one of the great financial forces with a stake in keeping the peace. But a family that becomes a symbol of invisible power does not get to choose what that symbol means. And the Rothschild name was about to be turned into something dark and dangerous. The price of the name. There is a part of the Rothschild story that we have a responsibility to tell honestly, because the myth of Rothschild power did not stay in the world of finance. It became one of the most enduring vehicles for anti-Semitism in modern history. For centuries, Jewish communities in Europe had been pushed toward money lending, precisely because they were barred from owning land, from guilds, from most other trades. And then they were hated for the very role they had been forced into. The Rothschilds, as the most visible Jewish financial family in the world, became the lightning rod for that ancient hatred. The dramatic Waterloo legend, the story of secret manipulation and ill-gotten millions, was not an accident. It was born in that 1846 French pamphlet as an attack. Over the following century, the family name was woven into conspiracy theories, claiming that Jews secretly controlled the wealth of nations. The famous quotes you may have seen online about controlling a nation's money and caring nothing for its laws were never said by any Rothschild. They were invented decades after Mayer Amschel's death, some of them in openly anti-Semitic books, and then repeated so many times that people assumed they must be real. This is the engine of conspiracy, a real fact that one family had become enormously influential in European finance, was inflated into a fantasy of total control, and that fantasy was weaponized. It reached its horrifying peak under the Nazis. In 1940, the Third Reich produced a film built around the Waterloo legend, designed specifically to portray the Rothschilds as parasites manipulating the world. It was described as one of the regime's first anti-Semitic film manifestos. And here is the bitter truth the conspiracy theories can never explain. When that hatred reached its height, the Rothschilds were not its masters. They were its victims. The Austrian branch of the family had their banks seized by the Nazis. Their palaces in Vienna were looted and destroyed. Their art was stolen. The family was forced to surrender everything and flee for their lives. The people the myth imagined secretly ruling the world were, in reality, being stripped of everything they owned and driven into exile by a government that used that very myth as a weapon. This is why we have to be careful with the Rothschild story. The temptation is to enjoy the legend, the secret power, the hidden hand, the family that controls everything. But that legend is not harmless. It has a body count. And the responsible way to tell this story is to hold two things at once: a real family of remarkable financial influence and a monstrous myth that was built on top of them and used to justify real horror. Influence made the Rothschilds powerful. Myth made them immortal. But that same myth made them a target. What the wheel reveals. So after 2 centuries of rumor and record, what is the real lesson of the Rothschilds? It is not that they secretly controlled the world. They didn't. Their fortune, vast as it was, fragmented across 7 generations and hundreds of descendants. Today there is no single Rothschild fortune, no secret throne. The numbers you see online, trillions of dollars, 80% of the world's wealth, are not just wrong. They are arithmetically impossible, larger than all the wealth that exists on Earth. The real lesson is stranger and more important. The Rothschilds reveal how power actually moved in the modern world. We are taught to see history as a story of kings, generals, and battles. But underneath every crown was a ledger. Behind every army was a loan. Behind every empire was the question no monarch could escape: who will pay for this? For most of the 19th century, part of the answer was a family from a lock street in Frankfurt. Not because they conspired to rule, but because they had built something genuinely new. A network that could move money and trust across a fractured continent faster than any state. They made themselves the infrastructure of power. And infrastructure, it turns out, is a quieter and more durable kind of influence than any throne. War creates debt. Debt creates dependency. Dependency creates influence. And the Rothschilds position themselves at the exact center of that chain. The point where war became debt and debt became power. That is the real machine. Not a secret cabal pulling strings, but a system. The fusion of war, money, information, and trust that built the modern world. The Rothschilds did not invent that system, but for a century, no family understood it better or wrote it higher. And here is the thesis at the heart of everything we do on this channel. The Rothschilds were not powerful because the myths about them were true. They were powerful because the system that created those myths was real. The wheel of fortune that lifted them, war, debt, credit, and the desperate needs of states, is the same wheel that has lifted and destroyed fortunes across all of history. The Rothschilds just happened to ride it more skillfully for longer than almost anyone before or since. But the wheel does not stop for anyone. It lifted them to the top of the world. And then slowly it turned as new banks rose, as fortunes scattered, as the family that once financed empires became one name among many. That is the nature of the wheel. It always turns. The wheel turns west. If there is one idea to carry out of this story, it is this. The most powerful forces in history are often the quietest. Not the king on the throne, but the banker who funds the throne. Not the army in the field, but the credit that pays the army. Power flows through money, and money flows through whoever understands it best. The Rothschilds understood it in the age of kings and cannon, but the wheel was already turning toward a new century and a new continent where the same forces would build something even larger and even more hidden. Because while Europe's banking dynasties were reaching their peak, a different kind of financial power was about to be born on the other side of the Atlantic. Not in a palace, not in a famous family, but in secret, on a private island off the coast of Georgia, where a handful of the most powerful financiers in America would gather under false names to design the institution that still controls your money today. That is where the wheel turns next. If this documentary helped you see war, debt, and power a little differently, if you want to understand the money beneath the history, then subscribe to Fortuna's Wheel. Leave a like, it genuinely helps this channel reach more people who think the way you do. And share this with someone who still believes history is only written by kings. The banks behind the wars, the debts behind the empires, the families who rose and fell as the wheel turned. This has been Fortuna's Wheel, and the wheel is still turning. Next, the Jekyll Island secret, how a weekend fishing trip and 7 men who weren't supposed to know each other's names created the Federal Reserve.